She said, "I'm no lady for a rancher," he said, "then I'll be the man you deserve." Under the fading light of a desert evening, the town of Clearwater Ridge sat quiet, like the world was holding its breath. The wind carried dust across the main street, whispering through the creaking wooden signs and the cracked windowpanes of the saloon. It was the kind of town where everyone knew your story, or thought they did. And for a woman named Clara Reeves, that was the very reason she'd been running. She rode into Clearwater on a chestnut mare, her clothes worn from the trail, her eyes dark and cautious under the rim of a hat too big for her slender frame. The horse was tired, the saddlebags light. She hadn't eaten in a day, hadn't slept in 2. But she didn't stop until she reached the edge of town, near a rail fence that bordered a wide stretch of open land that belonged to a man named Wade Carter. Wade was a rancher through and through. The kind that rose before the sun and didn't quit until the stars came out. He was tall, with a quiet strength about him that came from years of hard work and harder loss. Folks in town called him Steady Wade, not because he was friendly, he wasn't, but because he never faltered. Not when his father died, not when the drought nearly took the ranch, and not when his heart was broken by the woman he thought he'd marry. That evening, Wade was out fixing a busted fence post near the southern edge of his land when he saw her. A lone rider, silhouetted by the sinking sun, moving slowly but steadily. He squinted through the light, hand resting on the worn handle of his revolver, habit more than threat. When the horse stumbled, the woman caught herself, sliding off the saddle with a grace that looked practiced but tired. She turned, brushed the hair from her face, and for a moment, their eyes met across the field. There was something in her stare, a mix of pride and desperation. Wade had seen both before, in different men and women who'd come through town looking for work or a second chance. But this one, she looked like she'd been running from something she didn't want to name. He watched her hesitate, glanced toward town, then back at the fence. Finally, she spoke, voice soft but steady. "Is this Carter land?" Wade nodded once. "It is." She hesitated, catching her breath, "I was hoping to ask about work. I can ride, mend, and cook if need be. Don't need much." He studied her for a moment. She looked young, but her eyes told another story, one carved by survival. Her hands, though blistered, held the reins like someone who'd spent years in the saddle. He noticed the scuff marks on her boots, the torn seam on her sleeve. She wasn't a drifter by choice. "Don't get many women ridin' up here lookin' for ranch work," he said finally, voice calm but firm. "Guess I ain't most women," she replied, chin lifting slightly, as if daring him to doubt her. He didn't. He just nodded again, motioning toward the barn. "You can stable your horse there. We'll talk inside." She followed without another word, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt something close to safety. Not comfort, not yet, but the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she could stop running for a while. Inside the barn, the air was thick with hay and the faint smell of leather oil. She moved carefully, her fingers brushing along the stall doors. Wade watched her, his hat low over his brow, trying to read her without prying. "You got a name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. "Clara Reeves." "Where are you from, Clara Reeves?" She paused before answering. "Nowhere worth talkin' about." He didn't push. Everyone had their secrets, and a man who'd lived through his own heartbreak knew better than to go digging into someone else's. "All right," he said finally. "There's a spare bunk in the cookhouse. You help out where needed. If you pull your weight, you can stay till you find your bearings." She nodded, a quiet "thank you" escaping her lips before she caught it and looked away. Gratitude wasn't something she let herself feel often. It made her vulnerable, and vulnerability had nearly cost her everything once before. That night, as the crickets sang and the lantern light flickered through the window, Clara lay on the narrow cot in the corner of the cookhouse. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the creak of the windmill, made her tense. She was still half expecting to wake and find her past waiting outside the door. But instead, morning came gently. The sun rose over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Wade was already out, feeding the horses, his movements steady and sure. Clara watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping out, rolling up her sleeves. "Coffee's on the stove," she said quietly, almost like a peace offering. He nodded. "Appreciate it." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was simple. Two people used to their own company, figuring out how to share the same space. Days passed, and Clara proved herself in ways few expected. She hauled feed, mended fences, and even wrangled a loose calf when Wade was off fixing the windmill. The ranch hands took notice. So did Wade. There was a quiet determination in her, a kind that didn't come from pride, but from necessity. Yet for all her strength, Wade saw the cracks. The way she'd flinch at the sound of a raised voice, or how she'd tense when someone asked too much about her past. He didn't know her story, but he could tell she'd been through hell and back. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the world turned to fire, they stood side by side at the corral. The horses grazed nearby, the air thick with the scent of dust and sweet hay. "You work hard," he said finally, breaking the silence. She gave a small shrug. "Work's all I've ever known." "You runnin' from something, Clara?" She froze, eyes fixed on the horizon. For a moment, he thought she might walk away. But then she said softly, "A man who thought he owned me." Her voice didn't shake, but he could feel the weight behind it. Wade turned slightly, his jaw tight. "He's still lookin' for you?" "Maybe," she said. "But I ain't goin' back." Something passed between them then, not pity, not curiosity, but understanding. Wade had lost things, too, things no one could replace. "You ain't got to," he said quietly. "Not while you're under my roof." She looked up at him then, truly looked. There was no judgment in his eyes, no questions waiting behind his words. Just a man who'd seen enough pain to recognize it in someone else. That night, Clara lay awake again, but this time it wasn't fear that kept her up, it was confusion. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost. She was thinking about what she might be starting to find. And outside, under the wide Texas stars, Wade Carter stood at the fence line, looking toward the cookhouse light that hadn't yet gone out. He told himself it was just concern. Just making sure she was settling in. But deep down, he knew better. Something about that woman had already started to stir a part of him he thought had gone cold a long time ago. And he wasn't sure if that scared him, or saved him. The days rolled by like slow dust across the prairie, each one blending into the next, yet somehow different since she'd arrived. Wade had grown used to silence on the ranch, the kind that filled a man's head and heart with too many thoughts. But now there was another sound between those quiet hours, the steady rhythm of Clara's footsteps, the rustle of her work clothes as she moved through the barn, the low hum of her voice when she thought no one could hear her. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her words carried weight. She knew horses better than most men he'd hired and wasn't afraid to prove it. When one of the new foals took sick, she stayed by its side through the night, her hands gentle, her whispers calm. Wade had come out just before dawn, finding her half asleep against the stall door, the foal nestled close, breathing steady again. He didn't say a word, just handed her a blanket and a nod that meant more than thanks. Something had changed after that. There was trust in the air, quiet but growing. The ranch hands had stopped treating her like a stranger and started treating her like one of their own. Even old Hank, who barely trusted his shadow, had begun leaving his hat on the fence when Clara passed by, a silent show of respect. But the world outside the ranch didn't stay quiet for long. One morning, while Wade was in town getting supplies, Clara was gathering eggs from the chicken coop when she noticed a rider on the ridge. He wasn't close enough to make out clearly, but the way he sat tall in the saddle made her blood run cold. The sun glinted off a badge pinned to his coat, a sheriff's star, or something close. Her hands froze around the basket. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. Then she turned away, walking fast toward the barn. When Wade came back, he found her stacking hay bales with a little too much force, her face flushed and her hands trembling. He said nothing at first, just watched her from the doorway. After a moment, he stepped closer, his voice low and steady. He told her he'd seen tracks near the ridge on his way back, a single rider, headed east. She kept her back turned, but he could hear the tremor in her voice when she asked if he'd spoken to anyone in town. He told her he hadn't. He'd picked up feed, supplies, and the mail, nothing more. Then she stopped, her shoulders sinking. She told him that the man might not be just passing through. That some people didn't stop until they'd finished what they started. Wade knew better than to ask questions before she was ready to answer them. Instead, he said the only thing that mattered, that whoever it was, they wouldn't find her here unless she wanted to be found. For the rest of that day, Clara worked like she was trying to outrun her thoughts. Wade didn't push, but he didn't stray far either. That night, when the sky turned deep and full of stars, he saw her standing by the corral again, the same spot where they'd talked before. She looked small under all that sky. But there was a fire in her, quiet, buried deep, but strong. Wade joined her, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the horizon. She told him that back in Kansas, she'd been married once. The words came out like thorns, sharp and reluctant. Her husband had been a man of means, respected, powerful, cruel. He'd bought her love with promises, then broken every one. When she finally found the courage to leave, he'd sworn he'd track her down. Wade listened in silence, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. When she stopped speaking, he said only that no man had the right to own a woman's freedom. She looked up at him then, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in any man's before, not pity, not desire, but respect. From that night on, the air between them shifted. They started talking more, not about the past, but about small things. About the weather, the land, the way the horses behaved before a storm. Wade found himself watching for her without meaning to, when she laughed, when she brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, when her hand steadied his horse like she'd done it all her life. And Clara, though she tried not to, found herself waiting for his voice. That deep, calm drawl that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't known safety could feel. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the west one evening, black clouds swallowing the sunset. The wind howled, tearing across the prairie, and by the time the first thunder cracked, the cattle were restless, scattering toward the lower pasture. Wade was already in the saddle, shouting orders to the men. Clara didn't wait to be told, she grabbed her coat, mounted her horse, and rode out into the rain. The storm was vicious, the kind that made it hard to tell night from day. Lightning split the sky, thunder rolled through the hills, and mud sucked at the horses' hooves. Clara rode hard, pushing through the chaos to round up the cattle, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes fierce against the wind. Wade caught sight of her through the downpour, her figure illuminated for an instant by the lightning flash, wild and fearless. For a moment, he couldn't tell if it terrified him or made him fall deeper. Hours passed before they finally drove the herd into safety. When it was over, both were soaked, shivering, and too tired to speak. But when their eyes met in the flicker of the barn lantern, something passed between them that words couldn't touch. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. She didn't pull away. For a long moment, they stood there, two broken souls who'd found something unspoken in the storm. But peace never lasts long on the frontier. 2 days later, a letter arrived from town. The postmaster had held it, uncertain where to deliver it, but Wade's name was written clearly. Inside was a short message from the sheriff. A stranger had been asking questions about a woman matching Clara's description. Wade folded the letter slowly, his jaw tightening. That evening, he found her out by the paddock again. The sun was setting, washing everything in gold. He told her about the letter, his voice low and calm. She didn't look surprised, only sad, like she'd known it was coming. She told him she couldn't bring trouble to his door. That she'd leave before the man found her. Wade told her that it wasn't her choice to make alone. That she wasn't just some drifter anymore. She was part of the ranch now, part of his life. She looked up at him, tears catching the last light of day. She told him she wasn't a lady for a rancher, that she didn't deserve kindness, not after all she'd done to survive. And that's when he said it. Then I'll be the man you deserve. The words hung there between them, simple but heavy. She wanted to turn away, to keep the walls she'd built so carefully. But instead, she found herself stepping closer, her hand trembling as it brushed against his. That night, the stars burned bright over Clearwater Ridge, and though neither of them said another word, something in both their hearts had changed. Clara still didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time since she'd fled Kansas, she didn't feel like she was running. She felt like she was home. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of stillness that felt heavy, like the world was waiting for something to break. The ranch went on as it always had, horses fed, fences mended, cattle driven, but underneath it all, there was a nervous rhythm, one only Wade and Clara seemed to feel. She tried to lose herself in the work, pretending everything was fine, but her eyes still flicked toward the ridge more often than before. The horizon wasn't just land to her anymore, it was a threat waiting to take shape. Wade knew it, too. He started keeping a rifle near the porch and checking the perimeter every night before bed. He didn't talk about it, but Clara noticed. She noticed the way his jaw clenched when riders passed by on the road, how he stayed up late after everyone else had turned in, his lamp burning in the window long after midnight. It wasn't fear that drove him. It was something deeper, protection. And for Clara, that was something she hadn't known in years. One morning, just as the sun started to rise, a stagecoach came rattling down the main road into Clearwater Ridge. It stopped at the post house, dust billowing around the wheels. Out stepped a man in a dark coat, tall, lean, and sharp in the face. He carried himself like someone used to being obeyed, his boots polished, his hands gloved, his expression cold. The sheriff greeted him at the door, but the conversation was short. The stranger handed over a paper, a marriage license, stamped and signed. His voice was smooth, controlled, the kind that could charm a room if it wanted to. But his eyes, they were the kind that could turn ice to fire in an instant. By nightfall, word had already reached Wade that someone was asking about a woman named Clara Reeves. He said nothing to her that evening, but the tightness in his shoulders gave him away. She noticed it when they ate in silence, when he stood at the window staring out toward the hills. Finally, she said quietly that if trouble had come, it was hers to handle, not his. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw something almost like anger in his eyes, not at her, but at the world that had made her believe she had to face it alone. He told her the ranch wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs, all of theirs. And anyone who came to tear that apart would have to go through him first. That night, she didn't sleep. The air felt heavy, charged. She sat by the window, watching the moon drift through clouds, the wind carrying the faint sound of coyotes across the valley. By dawn, the man from the stagecoach was in town again, asking more questions. The sheriff told him to leave it be, that Clearwater Ridge didn't meddle in private matters. But the man didn't take kindly to being dismissed. He mentioned money, influence, said Clara was his wife and he'd come to bring her home. Wade was in town delivering grain when he heard that part. He froze in the doorway of the general store, his hand tightening around the crate he carried. The shopkeeper, seeing the storm in his eyes, said nothing. Wade stepped out into the street, his boots echoing against the boards as he crossed toward the saloon. The stranger was there, drinking at the bar, every inch of him out of place among the ranchers and miners. Their eyes met before either spoke. Wade asked him if he was the one looking for Clara Reeves. The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile, and said yes. Said he was her husband. Said she'd run off with things that didn't belong to her. Wade stood still for a moment, then said in that low, steady voice that had silenced many men before, that she wasn't his property anymore. The room went quiet. The man's smile faded, replaced by a sneer. He said Wade didn't know the kind of woman he was protecting, that she'd left behind a mess of lies and debts. Wade didn't move, didn't blink. He said every soul deserved a second chance, and if the man had come looking to drag her back to hell, he'd best turn around now. The stranger stepped closer, voice dropping to a hiss. He told Wade he'd regret getting between them. That no one ran from him, not for long. Then he tipped his hat, smirked, and walked out. Wade stood there for a long while, jaw tight, fists clenched. He could feel the weight of what was coming. By the time he returned to the ranch, the sun was setting behind the hills, turning the sky into fire. Clara was out by the barn, mending a saddle. She looked up, saw the look on his face, and knew before he said a word. She whispered that he'd found her, didn't she? He nodded. She dropped the leather strap, hands trembling, her breath catching like she'd been struck. She said she'd leave that night, before he came knocking at Wade's door. But Wade stepped forward, his voice quiet, steady as ever. He told her she wasn't running anymore. He said if that man wanted a fight, he'd find one. She told him she couldn't let him do that. That she couldn't be the reason another good man lost everything trying to protect her. He said protecting her wasn't losing, it was living. Tears burned in her eyes, but she couldn't speak. The words tangled in her throat, heavy with the weight of all the things she'd never let herself believe in. That night, she sat by the window again, staring out at the open land. Wade was on the porch, his rifle leaning against the rail, lantern burning low beside him. Neither of them slept. Just before dawn, a rider approached. The dogs barked, the horses stirred. Wade rose slowly, stepping off the porch as the figure came into view, dark coat, silver badge, a cruel smile under the brim of his hat. He called out for Clara, said he'd come to take his wife home. Wade stood firm. He said she wasn't going anywhere, she didn't want to. The night after Luke said those words, the world outside the cabin turned wild. Wind howled through the cottonwoods like restless spirits, and the rain came down hard, drumming on the roof in steady, relentless rhythm. Clara sat by the small hearth, her hands trembling slightly as she stitched at a torn sleeve that didn't need mending. Her eyes kept flicking toward the door, half hoping, half fearing that Luke might walk back through it. He had gone out to secure the horses before the storm worsened. She tried to protest, but he'd only given her that quiet half-smile, the one that could calm thunder, and told her to keep the fire alive. Now she waited. The seconds stretched thin, the air thick with things neither of them had dared to say. Every gust outside made her flinch. Every creak in the timbers sounded like footsteps. And in her chest, something soft and stubborn was beginning to stir, something she had buried years ago beneath the weight of shame and survival. When Luke finally returned, soaked through, his hat dripping, she rose quickly. He looked wild and beautiful in the firelight, hair plastered to his forehead, shirt clinging to his chest, the rugged lines of his face shadowed by flickering flame. He shut the door behind him, leaned his back against it, and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since he left. "You should have stayed by the fire," he said softly. "I couldn't," she murmured. "Not while you were out there." For a long moment, neither moved. The rain's rhythm filled the silence between them, steady as a heartbeat. Then, without quite knowing why, she reached for the towel hanging by the door and stepped closer. He didn't stop her. She dabbed at the rain on his face, her fingers brushing the rough edge of his jaw. His eyes met hers, calm and burning all at once. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said, voice low. "I'm not afraid of the storm," she whispered. "I wasn't talking about the storm." The fire crackled. The wind howled. And in that flickering light, two broken souls stood close enough to hear the other's heartbeat. But before anything could be said, a crash of thunder split the sky, and Luke turned sharply toward the window. Out past the glass, a shadow moved near the corral. He was across the room in a breath, reaching for the rifle near the door. "What is it?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "Someone's out there." He lifted the latch quietly, peering into the dark. A figure stumbled toward the porch, cloaked and mud-splattered. Then came a shout, faint but desperate. "Help! Please!" Luke swung the door open, rifle raised, until the lightning flashed and revealed a young man, barely 20, bleeding from a cut on his shoulder. His horse was nowhere in sight. "Put that thing down," Clara said sharply, already moving to help the stranger. "He's hurt." Luke lowered the rifle but didn't relax. The boy's eyes darted around the cabin before settling on Clara. "They're comin'," he gasped. "Men, outlaws. They took my brother. They'll kill him if I don't." He swayed, and Clara caught him just before he fell. Luke's jaw tightened. "Get him to the chair." They worked in silence, patching the boy's wound, giving him water, listening as he spoke between ragged breaths. He'd been riding through the night from a nearby settlement. A gang led by a man named Holt had been raiding ranches, taking livestock, money, even people. Clara froze at that name. "Holt," she whispered. "You're sure?" The boy nodded weakly. "Mean-looking fella, scar across his cheek." Clara's hands trembled. She knew that name all too well. Holt was the man her husband used to ride with. The same man who tracked her once before when she first ran. Luke saw the change in her face. "You know him?" She nodded slowly. "He's the reason I left everything behind." The wind rattled the shutters again, as if echoing the fear rising inside her. Luke's gaze hardened. "Then he's not getting anywhere near you this time." They sat the rest of the night on edge, taking turns watching the storm and the horizon beyond. Every flash of lightning felt like a warning. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the world outside was heavy with the smell of mud and danger. Luke saddled his horse before the sun was even high. Clara watched him from the porch, arms wrapped around herself. "You're going after them," she said quietly. "I am. You'll get yourself killed." He met her gaze, steady and sure. "If I don't, more folks will. Holt's kind doesn't stop till someone makes him." She stepped down, her boots sinking into the wet earth. "You can't fight every bad man on the plains." "No," he said softly. "But I can sure as hell fight the one who hurt you." She looked away, her eyes glistening. "You don't owe me that, Luke." "I reckon I do." He turned to mount his horse, but her hand caught his arm. The touch was light, trembling, but it stopped him cold. "Come back," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "That right there sounds like a promise." And then he rode out into the morning mist, alone, his figure fading down the muddy trail, the sound of hooves swallowed by the quiet. Clara stood there long after he was gone, the sun breaking through clouds above her, casting light over the ranch that suddenly felt too big, too empty. She'd spent years trying to forget what love cost. Now she realized it had just taken a different kind of courage to earn it back. As she turned toward the cabin, her eyes landed on the rifle leaning by the door, and she knew she wouldn't wait quietly. Because when a man rode into danger for your sake, love wasn't just something you felt. It was something you fought for. The man dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel. He said Wade didn't understand what kind of trouble he was inviting. Said Clara was his by law, and law didn't bend for love or pity. Wade didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. He just said one thing. That laws might belong to men like him, but this land belonged to folks who worked it, and no law could make a woman belong to anyone. The man's eyes darkened. He said Wade was making a mistake. Wade told him maybe so. But he'd made peace with worse. The standoff hung in the air, tense as a drawn bow. Inside the house, Clara watched from the window, tears streaming silently down her face. She could see every ounce of strength in Wade's stance, the way he held his ground not just for her, but for everything he believed in. And in that moment, she knew running wasn't the answer anymore. She stepped out onto the porch, voice steady though her heart trembled. She said she wasn't going with him. That whatever life he thought he owned, it was over. The man's face twisted in rage. He reached for his gun. But Wade was faster. The report echoed through the valley, loud and final. Birds scattered from the trees, the wind carrying the smoke away into the dawn. The man dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder, the weapon falling from his grasp. Wade stood over him, eyes hard. He told him to take his pride and his papers and get off his land before the sun finished rising. The man stumbled to his horse, hate burning in his eyes. He said it wasn't over. Wade said it was, as far as this land was concerned. When he was gone, the silence came back. Clara stood there, shaking, her breath uneven. Wade turned to her, the weight of what just happened settling in his chest. She said she hadn't meant for any of this. He told her he knew. He reached out, brushed a tear from her cheek, and said quietly that she didn't owe him anything, except the truth of who she wanted to be from here on out. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Then she whispered that she wanted to stop being someone who ran. Wade smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both pain and peace. He said maybe it was time she started learning what it meant to stay. The trail ran slick and silent through the valley, still damp from last night's rain. Luke rode fast, his jaw set, his eyes narrow under the brim of his hat. The land around him stretched wide and gray, lonely, unforgiving, and beautiful. He'd been born under this kind of sky, raised by the wind, shaped by dust and loss. But somewhere along the way, he'd learned that it wasn't the land that made a man strong, it was what he chose to stand for. And right now, he stood for Clara. He followed the tracks through the willows until the prints split, two riders had veered east toward the ridge. He slowed, studying the ground. One of the hoofprints was deep and erratic, as if the rider had been hurt or struggling. That had to be the boy's brother. He pressed his heels gently into his horse's sides and rode on. By midday, the sky was clearing, but tension clung to the air like smoke. Luke finally saw them ahead, two men on horseback dragging another between them, half-conscious. He pulled his rifle from the saddle and nudged his horse off the trail, moving through the trees. He could hear their laughter, rough and mean, the kind of sound that didn't care who it hurt. Then he saw Holt. Time slowed. The man was older than Clara remembered him, scarred, hard-eyed, carrying the kind of cruelty that never aged. He had a long coat whipping in the wind, and his hand rested easily on the gun at his hip. Luke had seen men like that before, men who thought fear was power. He stepped out into the open. Let the boy go. The laughter stopped. Holt turned, squinting into the sunlight. Well now, he drawled, ain't this a surprise? Another fool with a death wish. Luke's voice stayed calm. Last I checked, you're the one doin' the talkin'. Let him go and ride on. Holt grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. You're the one hidin' that woman, ain't you? The pretty runaway. She's still breathin'. Luke's jaw clenched. She ain't yours to talk about, he said evenly. Then she's yours, Holt said, eyes narrowing. Reckon I got a score to settle with both of you. The sound of his revolver clearing leather was fast, too fast for most men. But Luke wasn't most men. He fired first. The echo tore through the valley, rolling over the hills. One of Holt's men dropped where he stood. The other fled, his horse kicking up mud and panic. Holt staggered back, clutching his shoulder where the bullet grazed him, then ducked behind a rock, firing wildly. Luke moved like a shadow, calm and precise, until Holt's gun clicked empty. The outlaw stumbled into the open, blood on his coat and rage in his eyes. You think you're better than me? Holt spat. You think she'll stay with a man like you? Luke lowered his rifle slowly. I don't think. I just know she deserves peace. And that doesn't come from men like you. He swung the rifle one last time. The shot was clean. When the echo faded, only the wind answered back. Luke stood there for a moment, breathing hard, then turned to the boy lying in the dirt. The kid was weak but alive. He lifted him onto the horse and started the long ride home. Back at the ranch, Clara paced the porch, every heartbeat a storm in her chest. She tried to keep busy, tending the animals, fixing supper, but every creak in the distance made her look toward the trail. When she finally saw him riding back through the dusk, she didn't care about anything else. She ran. Luke slid from the saddle, catching her in his arms before his boots even hit the ground. For a moment, neither spoke, they just held on, breathing each other in like the first light after a long night. He's gone, Luke murmured finally. Holt won't hurt anybody again. She nodded against his chest, tears slipping free, not from fear this time, but release. I was so afraid, she whispered. Not of him, of losin' Hugh. He pulled back just enough to look at her. You ain't losin' me, Clara. Not now, not ever. The wind softened. The stars came out one by one, scattered across the open sky. Behind them, the cabin glowed warm and golden, the fire inside still alive, just like the promise between them. They stood there, framed by the land that had nearly broken them both, and for the first time, it felt like home. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. You still think you ain't no lady for a rancher? Luke asked quietly. She smiled through her tears. No, she said. But I reckon I found the man I deserve. He laughed softly, brushing a thumb over her cheek. Then I reckon I'll spend the rest of my days provin' you right. The night deepened around them, carrying the scent of rain and wildflowers. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, lonely, haunting, but somehow hopeful. And beneath the vast Texas sky, two souls once lost found there forever, not in perfection, but in the quiet strength of love that had weathered every storm. Because some hearts weren't made to be tamed. They were just waitin' for someone brave enough to stay.